This is the American Law Journal.
The FDA, everyone's favorite punching bag. Big Pharma says it delays getting their drugs to market. Consumers wonder if they're protected. If both sides are dissatisfied, I wonder if they're getting it right. Good evening, I'm Christopher Naughton. This is the American Law Journal. The FDA is almost 100 years old. Are they living up to their charter? All right, four guests join me tonight. Let's go ahead and meet them. Stephen Scheller is with Scheller PC in Philadelphia, plaintiff's attorney. The firm is at the forefront of national pharmaceutical product liability and whistleblower litigation. Ed Silverman joins us once again from Pharmalot. He's the award-winning journalist formerly with the Newark Star-Ledger. Hope Freiwald also graces us with her presence once again. Defense attorney with Dechert, and at Dechert, of course, known around the world for their product liability defense work. And joining us tonight for the very first time, Matt Harman with Harman Law in Atlanta, Georgia, a former defense attorney with King & Spalding, and now for several years representing plaintiffs in these matters. Matt, you know that Steve has been a plaintiff's attorney for his entire life. Hope, I think, has been pretty much on the side of the defense as long as I've known her, representing pharmaceutical companies. You used to be with King & Spalding, and you represented pharma companies. You're a plaintiff's attorney for the last several years. Do you find that your opinion of the FDA and its value has changed much once you changed hats?
No, Christopher, my opinion of the FDA has not changed. We need the FDA. The FDA is entrusted with a monumental task to review and approve drugs. But the point is that I think that the pharmaceutical industry has used the FDA and the laws that have created the FDA to prevent injured plaintiffs from getting their day in court.
So what they have done is they have seeded the FDA with their own people. Let me give you some specific examples.
You're one of the great conspiracy theorists of the world, but if everybody believed you, they would believe that pharmaceutical companies are just there to corrupt the world.
But
not just pharmacists.
Let me just clear this out, though. It's not their intention to get dangerous drugs out to market.
I think even by your standards, you're a little overboard, Steve.
To make as much money as they can get away with. That's what it's all about, greed. Now let's get to the specifics, Hope. Steven Spielberg, not Steven Spielberg, the movie director, but Steven Spielberg, the deputy commissioner of the FDA. Where did he come from? He just left this past January. He was one of the top vice presidents for pediatric development at Johnson & Johnson, one of the companies that I find very difficult because I read their report for their shareholders the other day. I've never seen such a long list of litigation against them and misconduct ever in my history.
What position does Spielberg now have at the FDA?
Spielberg now retires. He had some independent company that's going to do research. He was the deputy commissioner. He is then replaced by Leonora Breder-Gatti, MD. And who is she? Now, new deputy commissioner for the FDA. She worked for Johnson & Johnson for 17 years in senior positions.
All right, so long story short, Steve, is, and this was going to be a question that I want to ask.
They control the FDA, and that's why all these problems we've had with the drugs is going on. You've got the foxes in the chicken coop, and you don't have one fox, you got a bunch of them.
It's a great jury speech because it allows you not to talk about the science and not to talk about medicine, which is a lot harder to talk about.
I want to talk about science.
No, let me finish.
They're the ones that don't talk about science. They are salespeople.
Go ahead, Hope, make your point.
Okay, so I think it's a great conspiracy theory that Steve spins out, but come on. I mean, pharmaceutical companies are in the business of providing medicines to patients. No company can exist if it really has the ill motives that Steve wants to attribute. When you put medicines on the market that are there to treat complicated illnesses, there's always going to be some risk, and sometimes those risks play out over years. But
Hope,
the
I'm
FDA...
complete agreement with you. The problem is they lie about the risk, they hide the risk, and they cut the foxes
Come on, that's just silly. Everybody knows that branded companies companies can be sued and are sued sometimes. But going back to Steve's point, that's not because the process is fundamentally flawed. It's because this is hard. Science and medicine is hard, and sometimes with drugs that have risks and benefits, there are issues.
Do you think that he feels he's going to get a fair shake in front of the FDA if it, as in his own, I think in his own words, it's a pharma alumni club?
There are drugs that don't get approved. Most drugs don't get approved. There are drugs that get reviewed and the labels get changed. There are drugs that get withdrawn voluntarily or not voluntarily.
Certain companies, and I don't disagree with what Hope is saying. The problem is some companies control the FDA, in my opinion.
Ed, let me go to you. I mean, you cover pharma. You don't really seem to have a dog in this fight. You always seem to play it down the middle on Pharmalot. Give us some insight from your perspective as to the makeup of the FDA and those people who are in the private sector now working with the FDA. Should we be concerned?
Well, I think that there's a tension there. I mean, first of all, I do agree that we need an FDA, because without an FDA, obviously, to me, we'd have lots of people selling snake oil and used snake oil, which is even worse. At the same time, the FDA is getting a lot of its funding from user fees, industry user fees, more and more. There's now generic industry user fees. So there's a natural inclination to think that there's a problem there. And it's only in the last few years, in fact, that the FDA has been pressured to address things like conflicts of interest on their own advisory committee rosters. The problem is that the FDA is often caught in betwixt and between. It's not a perfect situation, never will be.
Matt, let me throw the same question to you again, someone who's been on both sides of the fence. Should we be concerned about so many people, as Steve alleges, and I don't know what the makeup is, but so many people who are pharma company alumni who populate the FDA?
Well, I think you should always be concerned, but what the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry would say, and rightfully so, is that FDA needs people who have knowledge and experience about pharmaceuticals, and one of the best places to get that knowledge and experience is at pharma companies.
I think that's a good point. The other point I would make is that I think sometimes there's not enough attention paid to conflicts on the other side of the equation. I mean, there are academics who have made their entire career around purporting to find effects from drugs. They look in Medicare and Medicaid databases and they seem to tease out some result that shows that virtually every drug has some problem, and their entire academic life.
They're not working for the FDA.
Well, they have an interest in that, and that impacts the FDA.
Let some of them work for the FDA, so you have both sides there.
You see FDA advisory boards that have citizens members on them that have their own bias. You see FDA advisory boards that have people who fundamentally believe that we approve too many drugs. Their view was let's use the older drugs. Let's not approve so many new drugs. There are all kinds of biases, and I think Matt's point is a very valid one, which is that we want people with deep knowledge of medicine and deep knowledge of drug development, and that's going to come in many cases from people who have either direct industry ties or people who may have the benefit of industry funding for some of their research.
I don't disagree, except I don't want them running the FDA. And for example, you mentioned the advisory committees. The Pediatric Advisory Committee for Drugs just met, and one of the members of the committee was a guy named Samuel D. Maldonado. He was a member for the business community. And what does he do? He's director of pediatric drug research development for Johnson & Johnson. And here they were considering a Johnson & Johnson drug to extend the patent on it for children. And this is a drug called Risperdal that I'm very uncomfortable with. I don't think any child should take Risperdal. It's approved for uses in autism for children and things like that. And these are kids who are subject to being taken to problems. And why would you throw a drug at them that has, for some of the uses, and it's troubling me. So I filed my own petition to revoke the approval for Risperdal.
Was there something dealing with that drug, or maybe it was another drug, where the Pediatric Advisory Committee voted, I think, 11-0 or 13-0? 12-0. Don't let kids, because originally that drug you're talking about was not, kids were not permitted to take it, or the FDA did not approve it for that particular age group.
In 2008, they asked for long-term studies of the safety of that, unanimously overruling the recommendation of the FDA staff. And guess what? That long-term safety study has not been done yet.
Let me get last words here from Matt Harman. What words of advice can you give both plaintiff and defense lawyers about how we can best work with the FDA so that both sides are represented and both feel that they're getting a fair shake? Because I don't think really either side believes they're getting a fair shake. Maybe Hope feels that the pharmaceutical industry is getting somewhat of a fair shake, but certainly not Steve.
Well, first of all, the FDA is comprised of people. And anytime you have a group of people, especially a governmental agency, you're going to have a few bad apples. But for the most part, the folks at the FDA are trying to do a good job. And the second point is, FDA is only as good for branded drugs when they do their approval process as what the drug company tells them. If you have a company that's completely honest and forthright and transparent with the FDA, you're going to have a good result. Unfortunately, I've seen far too often, I think everyone in the room has, that's not been the case. So when lives are at stake, and they certainly are when we're talking about drugs and medical devices, it's paramount to have complete transparency between the drug company and FDA, and frankly, the public.
And where do you think this goes to next, Matt? What do you think is going to happen with the FDA as it relates to the safety of drugs moving forward here?
Unfortunately, I don't think much is going to happen. I think the only body that can really do a lot of change at FDA is Congress. And, well, good luck with that.
Matt Harman with Harman Law in Atlanta, Georgia, again, formerly with King & Spalding, plaintiff's attorney in mass tort matters. Matt, thanks for joining us. We appreciate you being here with us this evening. Take care of yourself.
Thank you.
All right. Getting back to your point, Steve, Pediatric Advisory Committee. There are some advisory committees who will make a suggestion. Who ultimately makes the decision with the FDA? Because an advisory committee does not. Who makes up this committee?
The FDA panel that's reviewing the particular drug has the authority to make the decision or not, and the advisory committee, by definition, is an advisory committee.
Yeah, but if you
and you can't have it both ways. You can't have it both ways, Steve. You can't say, well, the advisory committees are biased in favor of industry, and here's an example where the advisory committee went against industry and the FDA didn't listen to the advisory committee.
And
I mean, if your argument is about bias, you're kind of undermining your argument with that example, I have to say. What happens?
I find it difficult to understand why the FDA didn't listen, and to this day doesn't listen to its own Pediatric Advisory Committee.
And I'm hoping I would ask the question if it was
Why
the
aren't
other
they
way.
listening
I
to
would
it?
ask the question if it was the other way around. Let's say 12 people said, yeah, go ahead and you let this drug go to market into the stream of commerce, let children take this drug, and then the FDA said no. I would ask, why have an advisory committee?
Look, first of all, I want to be clear. I'm not talking about any particular drug. So I'm taking these questions as hypotheticals.
Sure.
But the fact of the matter is that the FDA may have a broader perspective than the advisory committee in a particular situation. So the FDA may be looking at other drugs in the class.
Employees as deputy commissioners.
The FDA has gone both ways, and I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. The Public Citizen actually looked at this issue once, tried to determine whether there was any correlation between supposed conflict of interest and outcome at the FDA, and they weren't able to find any. This is very complicated stuff, and nobody's going to say that the decisions get made right every single time.
I hope it isn't complicated for me. I know very specifically
as a conspiracy theory view of the world, which is very simple.
I don't have a conspiracy theory. I know what happened here. A drug is approved strangely in October 2006 for treatment of irritability associated with autistic disorder. What a garbage approval.
You think that there's unwarranted influence. And I mean, years ago, during the Bush administration, for example, Gail Naughton, who was in the private sector and industry, is put in as the Secretary of the Interior. That's the kind of, take somebody from private sector and put them in a position of power in the government. You're saying the same sort of thing is happening in the FDA. Is that right?
Unfortunately, it is. In the Pediatric Advisory Committee, which you brought up, that was in 2008. So now the new Pediatric Advisory Committee in 2013.
Well, my question
has
for you is this, though.
changed.
But this is my question. You know, we covered that. You folks have duked it out on this set before, and I think going back to 2006 or 2007, we were having this kind of a conversation.
Right.
That was during Bush's administration. That was Bush's FDA.
Right.
All right, now fast forward to 2012, 2013. Now it's Obama's FDA. Okay, so if you're saying that the FDA is now the Johnson & Johnson Alumni Club, that's Obama. He's against tort reform. He certainly has been going after whistleblowers. How can you be happy with this president and this administration? And is it no different than what you claim Bush did 5, 6, 7 years ago?
You are right. I am troubled by Obama allowing this to go on under his presidency. I think he's got to take a look at the FDA and bring back people like David Kessler, who was a Clinton and a Bush appointee at one time. He was a fair man. He did a great job. And the problem I have with the FDA is that there are certain companies that seem to have their drugs which are used. You can't do blood work for these antipsychotic drugs to determine if somebody really needs them. They are vague drugs, and they have very, very dangerous adverse events.
You know, I don't think
And
that
that's what
lawyers
troubles
like
me.
Steve, or like me for that matter, should be deciding what patients need. That should be a matter for medical and scientific evidence. So I think Steve is just, frankly, you're out of your area on that one.
As long as we feel we can trust the FDA and we can trust the information doctors are getting, right?
Which
may be at the root of his argument. I don't want to make the argument for him.
Steve's argument is, Steve actually is in the camp of people who do have a particular bias, which is that we don't need certain kinds of medicines, and we should have fewer medicines. And I think it's important to talk about the fact that at root, that's his bias. He's prepared to come out and say, I, a plaintiff's lawyer who make my living by suing pharmaceutical companies, get to say that we don't have a need for autism drugs, that we don't have a need for certain kinds of reactions in children.
This is not a bias issue. This is a fact issue. That's the problem.
The FDA has the right to review these medicines.
The fact you've proffered tonight is those making the decisions for the FDA are largely, again, alumni of Big Pharma.
Right.
That's your point. That may not be.
And I would like some alumni. Get some alumni like me.
I do have to say that I think he hasn't actually
pediatric
made that
advisory
point
committee.
because he's
the
pointed.
chance of me being appointed to one is zilch.
If I can just make my point, I think Steve has pointed to 1 or 2 people on advisory committees. That's a far cry from saying the FDA is owned by industry. But I think the bigger point.
And do you know the makeup of the FDA? Do we know who's making? And we'll get back to you, Hope.
Okay.
Do we know who are making some of these decisions? I mean, Steve's saying again, it's an alumni club. We're putting foxes in the chicken coop. Is there any merit to his argument?
Well, before I answer that, I would like to point out that when it comes to Bush and Obama, they were both rather obstinate in letting the Plan B contraceptive find its way to women, young teenage girls below the age of 17 without a prescription and over the counter.
Okay.
Both administrations were extremely stubborn and taken to task by a federal court judge as recently as a few days ago. So that has nothing to do with industry influence in terms of the context of this discussion, but I'd like to point out that they've both been scolded for their behavior.
Thank you, Ed. Now, can you address that other issue? As far as from what your knowledge, I mean, people making decisions inside the FDA. I mean, Steve's saying, again, it's the alumni club. It's a problem. Hope says, I'm not really sure if that's the makeup. And is that a problem on its face? Probably not, Hope would say. What do you say?
I would say it's not the makeup.
I know. I understand it's more both for you.
It's more complicated than that. You have, I think it was Matt Harman who said just a few minutes ago, you have a lot of different people making up the agency. You have different divisions within that agency who are tasked with looking at and reviewing different drugs as the materials come in, and then they get the advisory committee recommendations. So you have different internal politics, if you will. You have different personalities, different agendas, but people with different experiences and views as a result. Right. I don't necessarily think it's entirely uniform at that level. As you work your way up the chain, then you have a more siloed approach to the final decision making, perhaps, if you want to look at it that way. But you also have reviewers inside who have been notoriously notorious advocates for certain drugs and certain viewpoints and trying to get drugs off the market or prevent approval. So it's not all or nothing. That's really
yeah,
what
and I
I'm trying to
agree
say.
with that. It's not all or nothing. It's the silo approach. I don't like what's going on right now, and that's what disturbs me, and that needs to change, because you know why? The Congress is busy trying to balance the budget. When we have drugs that are costing Medicare and Medicaid billions of dollars a year, that is a tax on our taxpayers. Those drugs, yes, I am biased in one sense. I don't want useless, dangerous drugs on the market costing taxpayers money. I call this welfare for certain drug companies, and frankly, the taxpayer is getting raped by this thing. And we need to, if they really want to save money on our budget for medicine, Medicare, and Medicaid, then this should be stopped. These antipsychotic drugs, these SSRIs, these painkillers, this needs to be stopped. And I'll tell you what, if it is stopped, if we get people in the FDA who really follow science and require testing be done, when an FDA advisory committee says, I want long-term testing, and the staff says, no, we don't, I'd fire the staff. How could they say that?
You know, it's a great...
And that was in 2008. That's still happening today.
It's a great argument until you're the person, or your mother, or your father, or your child is the person who needs the medication. When it's easy when you've never experienced pain to say, why can't we all just live, you know, with a Tylenol or an aspirin over the counter, and then have serious pain and find that the first couple things don't work for you, and you need something that you can use all day. You're not going to have to.
I'll give you the painkillers. You give me the antipsychotics.
That you're not going to, you know, that you're not going to have to use 6 times a day.
I want to save the taxpayer money.
And you know, you have older people with dementia who do have violent behavior and do need medications. It's a really difficult business. And does everything come out right? No, it doesn't. But the notion that there is some deep-seated problem, I think it's much more the way Ed says, is that at different levels you have people who are trying to do their best and come at it with different perspectives. And we've seen decisions across the board.
The problem I have is that we don't have truthful information in many cases. And I am particularly incensed when it comes to children who are vulnerable. That requires special protections. And where the FDA has failed miserably, our country and our taxpayers and our children, is in this area. And steps must be taken to correct that. This is not a debate. This is what's right and what's wrong. And greed, and stopping greed, you cannot be selling a product without giving all truthful information, and you cannot ignore your honest people in the lower echelon of the FDA who try to do the right thing, and you cannot be seeding the upper levels with foxes. You've got to get fair balance, and that's all I'm saying has to be done, and we aren't doing it in certain cases, and it's costing the taxpayer and billions of dollars.
Hope, last words for you tonight. Steve just got in his closing argument.
Yeah, I mean, Steve just says these kind of hyperbolic things, and he doesn't actually.
Well, I have plenty of proof.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do, except you don't offer it. I mean, look, it's always difficult to test a medicine in every population that might use it. But I think the last word here is that. On balance, I think the FDA is trying to do the right things. Is it perfect? No. Are there things that I think both sides would like to see tweaked? Yes. But what patients should know is that, you know, there's a lot of information out there, and they need to have conversations with their doctors, and doctors need to be informed about the medicines they're prescribing, and that means really reading the label and being prepared to be knowledgeable about the medicine you're prescribing. And I think the drug companies are, for the most part, doing their best to get out appropriate information reflecting the risks and benefits of their products.
And Ed, let's finish with commentary from you tonight, because look, the FDA has taken a lot of heat again from pharmaceutical companies, from plaintiffs groups, from consumer groups. They're doing a lot of work, some of them overworked, underpaid. We don't take a lot of money out of our budget and dedicate it towards the FDA, although I heard that they did get a slight expansion in the last budget. But tell us what the FDA is facing right now, and in turn, how does that affect all of us in this area of the law and anyone who takes a drug in this country.
Well, the agency does face a test coming up concerning labeling. There was a court ruling not long ago that said generic drug makers don't have to change their labels if they hear of an adverse event or a series of adverse events, so long as the label matches the same wording that's carried for the identical brand name drug. So that opened up, or that caused a hue and cry, because a lot of people said, well, wait a second. Patient safety is at stake. If you take a generic drug and the manufacturer isn't required to upgrade or update the labeling, then patients can get hurt. A few months ago, the Justice Department revealed in a brief in a different case, but somewhat related theme, that the FDA is now looking at changing or updating language for regulation that would essentially close the door or close that loophole, if you want to think of it that way. Now, what the agency will actually do, when they will do it, what the wording will look like, whether that will stick, remains to be seen. But the fact that they're actually going to consider that and moving on it, from what I understand, is a test for the agency to essentially protect the consumer, because the labeling, regardless of what kind of drug we're talking about, brand name or generic, ought to reflect the reality of the patient experience out there.
Yeah, but that was a Supreme Court 5-4 decision, and you know who the 5 were, the bad guys up there. And
well, the ruling sticks, though,
they
they've got to deal with it.
That's the problem. Our courts are stacked too. Remember, I mentioned Dr. Stransfield here, and we have a problem. Our courts are stacked sometimes with bad decisions.
A lot of
these things have to change.
A lot of these drug cases, again, whether they work for the pharmaceutical companies or consumers, there are a lot of 5-4 decisions out there. Whether it's Wyeth v. Levine, which doesn't work for you folks, works for Steve, or whether it's Plivet versus Metzi, which works for you but not for Steve. I mean, it really will. The makeup of the Supreme Court really is going to be the guidepost here, because lots of 5-4 decisions with generic drugs. The Bartlett case was just argued recently as well.
Yes, it was.
I mean, generic drugs 3 times in 3 years. Those cases come before the Supreme Court. So we're not ending. This is not going to end anytime soon.
No, and there are challenges with the generic drugs, and frankly, from the standpoint of somebody who represents branded companies, for the most part, there are safety issues that the branded companies sometimes raise when you have greater generic entrants. But I have to say, Steve says he's not a conspiracy theorist, but I think I've heard him mention Dr. Strangelove at least 10 times on this program. So,
You mean is that your client?
Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that people aren't out to get you, Steve.
I want to thank my 3 guests tonight.
You know what?
Last comment here. I'm not done yet, I guess.
The people aren't out to get your client. They're only trying to do the right thing. And that's the problem. You call that a conspiracy. I call it honesty, integrity, and ethics.
And we will have to agree.
That's what this is all about.
We'll have to agree to disagree on that note. Steve Scheller with Scheller PC. He's been in practice since 1977, representing those injured by dangerous drugs. Ed Silverman joining us once again from Pharmalot. Go to pharmalot.com, the award-winning journalist from the Newark Star-Ledger, and Hope Freiwald always keeps it real. Very interesting, always passionate. Hope, it's always great to have you here. From Dechert, known, again, around the world for their product liability defense work, if you hadn't already guessed it. And Matt Harman joined us earlier tonight from Harman Law in Atlanta. So for all of us here at the American Law Journal, thank you for joining us this week. And until next week, case closed.
Tonight's American Law Journal has been made possible in part by Scheller PC, a nationally recognized personal injury law firm protecting individuals against dangerous pharmaceutical medicine, including antidepressants, antipsychotic drugs, defective products and medical devices, and other personal injury matters. And the Legal Intelligencer, the nation's oldest legal newspaper for lawyers.